What if I told you that the princess you thought you knew never actually woke up? What if the kiss that supposedly saved her was never a kiss at all, but something far more sinister? And what if the story we've been telling our children for generations was deliberately sanitized to hide one of literature's darkest secrets? Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on Sleeping Beauty, and I promise you'll never look at fairy tales the same way again. Because the woman lying unconscious in that tower wasn't waiting for true love's kiss. She was trapped in an endless nightmare that would make your worst horror movie seem like a lullaby. The story begins not with Disney's Aurora or even the Brothers Grimm, but in the shadows of 14th century Italy, where a man named Giovanni Boccaccio first put quill to parchment to record what he called the Sleeping Beauty of the wood. But Boccaccio's version wasn't meant for children. It was a cautionary tale whispered among adults. A story so disturbing that it would be rewritten, sanitized, and buried beneath centuries of false romanticism. In Boccaccio's original manuscript, discovered in a monastery outside Florence in 1897, the sleeping princess wasn't cursed by a vindictive fairy. She was poisoned, deliberately, by her own father. King Lothair of the fictional kingdom of Valdres had grown obsessed with his daughter's beauty as she approached her 16th birthday. Court records that Boccaccio claimed to have consulted describe the monarch slowly descending into madness, convinced that his daughter's marriage to any man would be a betrayal of their sacred bond. The king's advisors watched in horror as he began referring to Princess Rosalia not as his daughter, but as his eternal bride. When suitors began arriving at the castle, Lothair's jealousy reached a breaking point. He commissioned the court alchemists to create a poison that would preserve his daughter's beauty forever, keeping her in a state between life and death. The princess would remain young, beautiful, and his alone for all eternity. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. The poison didn't work as intended. Instead of killing her, it left Princess Rosalia in a catatonic state, aware, but unable to move or speak. She could hear everything, feel everything, but was trapped inside her own body like a living corpse. For 7 years, she remained in this condition, tended to by servants who believed she was truly unconscious. Her father would visit daily, talking to her motionless form, brushing her hair, and, according to the manuscripts, engaging in behaviors that even Boccaccio couldn't bring himself to describe in detail. Referring only to the king's unholy devotions to his sleeping daughter, then came the prince. But Prince Aldric wasn't the noble hero of later retellings. He was a neighboring royal fleeing his own kingdom after murdering his brother for the throne. When he stumbled upon the castle and discovered the sleeping princess, he didn't see a damsel in distress. He saw an opportunity. The most horrifying part of Boccaccio's account is what happened next. The prince didn't kiss the princess. According to the original text, he assaulted her repeatedly over the course of several months, believing she couldn't resist or remember. But Princess Rosalia was aware of everything. She felt every violation, heard every cruel word, experienced every moment of degradation while being unable to scream, unable to fight back, unable to escape. 9 months later, still unconscious to the outside world, she gave birth. The trauma of childbirth, combined with the prince's latest assault, finally broke the alchemical hold the poison had over her body. But when she awakened, it wasn't to a fairy tale ending. She found herself surrounded by the decomposing bodies of her father and the prince, who had killed each other in a jealous rage just days before. The princess had awakened not to love, but to a charnel house. Her baby, born sickly from the poison still in her system, had died within hours. She was alone, traumatized, and surrounded by death in a castle that had become her tomb. But the story doesn't end there. According to Boccaccio's notes, Princess Rosalia didn't live happily ever after. The trauma had shattered her mind. She spent her remaining days wandering the castle halls, talking to the corpses of her tormentors, believing she was still trapped in her poisoned sleep, and that everything around her was just another layer of nightmare. Local peasants reported seeing lights in the abandoned castle windows and hearing a woman's voice singing lullabies to no one. They claimed she had become something between a ghost and a madwoman. forever trapped between sleep and waking, between life and death, between sanity and madness. The story spread throughout Europe, but as it traveled, it transformed. The incestuous father became a fairy godmother. The rapist prince became a noble hero. The poison became a magical curse. The assault became a kiss. The madness became a happy ending. Why was the story changed so dramatically? Medieval scholars believe it was deliberate cultural sanitization. The original tale was too disturbing, too real, too reminiscent of actual abuses happening in royal courts across Europe. Families wanted fairy tales that would teach their daughters to be obedient and wait for rescue, not stories that revealed the horrors that rescue might actually entail. Charles Perrault, who published his version in 1697, explicitly stated in his personal letters that he had cleansed the tale of its earthly corruptions to make it suitable for Christian instruction. The Brothers Grimm went even further, transforming what remained of the darkness into pure fantasy. But here's what's truly chilling. Historians have found records suggesting that Boccaccio's story might not have been entirely fictional. In the archives of the Vatican, there are sealed documents dating to 1348 that reference a sleeping sickness that affected several noble daughters across Italy. These young women would fall into catatonic states and remain conscious but paralyzed for months or years. Modern medical experts who have reviewed these historical accounts believe the symptoms match a rare form of encephalitis lethargica, a brain inflammation that can cause exactly this type of conscious paralysis. But the disturbing pattern was that these cases almost exclusively affected young women from wealthy families. And in several instances, the women were found to be pregnant when they eventually recovered or died. Some historians now theorize that what we call Sleeping Beauty syndrome might have been a cover story used by noble families to hide systematic abuse. Young women who were assaulted by family members or guests could be declared cursed and kept in isolation. Their pregnancies explained away as mysterious, magical occurrences. The most bone-chilling evidence comes from the diary of a 14th century physician named Lorenzo di Caprese, discovered in 1962. Di Caprese wrote about being called to examine several of these sleeping beauties and finding clear evidence of repeated sexual assault. When he tried to report his findings to authorities, he was threatened with excommunication and execution. In his final entry before disappearing entirely from historical records, Di Caprese wrote, "The sleeping beauties are not cursed by magic, but by men. They sleep not under fairy spells, but under the weight of sins committed against them. And we, in our silence, are the true monsters in this tale." So when you read Sleeping Beauty to a child tonight, remember what you're really looking at. You're seeing the sanitized remains of a story about abuse, trauma, and the systematic silencing of victims. The real Sleeping Beauties weren't waiting for true love's kiss. They were trapped in a nightmare that society chose to rewrite as a dream. The princess in the tower wasn't sleeping peacefully. She was screaming silently, waiting not for rescue, but for the courage to tell her story in a world that preferred beautiful lies to ugly truths. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real moral of this tale. Sometimes, the most important thing we can do is wake up and listen to the voices that have been silenced for too long. The next time someone tells you fairy tales are just harmless stories, remember Princess Rosalia. Remember that behind every sanitized tale, there might be a truth too dark for bedtime, but too important to forget, because the real monsters in fairy tales were never the dragons or the witches. They were the people who rewrote history to hide the screams,